Here we go, nonprofit cloud. So correlating need with nonprofit cloud tools. We've spent a lot of time looking at the tools themselves, but even more importantly, if you've worked with nonprofits or with people in general, right? Change is hard. And the people are the single most important part of the project, regardless of what you're doing from the standpoint of technology itself. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Is change difficult for an organization? I think we know the answer to that, but we're going to look at some tools that will help us accommodate that difficult. Kathy and I are both here today, back from vacation, back from holidays, back from being sick. I think everybody had some sort of sickness over the holidays. So I appreciate that you all were flexible and letting me not be here last week. Appreciate that very much. Kathy has posted office hours, I'm sure, at the end of the slide deck presentation today. And then, of course, you can always find out the homework or see the video from last time on the website. So just a reminder. So the most difficult part of creating something new is often not the technology itself, but creating an atmosphere that will welcome change. So you may be asking why we're not jumping right into studying the installation, implementation, and configuration of all the great building blocks we've learned about in nonprofit cloud. But the fact that the certification weighs the consultant work so heavily should give you a hint. Years of hands-on experience validates that setting the scene for success before we begin is the most logical way. So we're going to focus today on organizational alignment and change management and what that means, governance basics and COEs, and user adoption and metrics for success. During 2020 and 2021, the pandemic created vast amounts of change for all of us. Some of us liked it, some of us not so much. But the pandemic was an outside influence that exerted immense amounts of pressure on people and organizations to change, to do different things, from the way they worked, the way they did business, the way they entertained themselves, and so much more. So at its worst, change can be painful. And at its best, it can at least be uncomfortable. Most organizations would rather limp along with a system that is painful to use because they're familiar with it. So the devil we know rather than the devil we don't, right? I would tell you that that's not the way that we want to continue. The important thing is to get a group of people aligned around what their goals and strategies are for a project. How many times do you have something as simple as the kids say, "I'm hungry," and you're like, "Great, what would you like for dinner?" And they can't answer that question, right? Or there are 3 different ideas about what dinner should be. So how do you get a group of people aligned around what their goals and strategies are for a project? 2 tools in particular that I recommend are the V2 Mom, which you're probably already familiar with as a Salesforce practitioner, and consequence scanning, which you may not know quite as much about. The V2 Mom is a great way to define what it is that you want to do. This was the outcome of Nonprofit Dreaming. But for Nonprofit Dreaming, which I use as a case study in the book, we had 24 people from all across the world, from various different organizations. Some were folks who were embedded in a nonprofit, some were consultants, some were just simply volunteers, and trying to align around what we wanted Nonprofit Dreaming to be and to accomplish was not an easy task. Everybody had their own ideas. Everybody had their own areas that they wanted to champion. And we worked to put that together in a way that made sense. Paul Ginsberg, who lives in the Netherlands, is a Golden Hoodie and an MVP, was on that team. And he insisted that we create a V2 Mom. And I have to admit, I was one of the ones I wasn't so sure about it. How would that help? Would that be good? but it did. It was amazing. And at the beginning of every planning meeting, we went back through and looked at the V2 Mom, because we worked together to create that V2 Mom. It aligned us on what our direction and priorities were. And so every time we had a question as a team, we would weigh every decision based on that V2 Mom that we had created. So I would highly encourage you. There is a link in the slide deck. If you haven't done a V2 Mom, this is a great time of year to do a personal V2 Mom. I've done that for myself as well. It's one thing to align yourself, align a group of people. It's another thing to know what you want to do by actually writing it down, assessing each of those areas, vision, values, metrics, obstacles and measures. And you are going to be better for having taken on that task for yourself. When you're working with a team on creating a new product or a new functionality, again, it helps to establish what the goals actually are and how you know you've met those goals. Another, and my very favorite, and if you've seen me present recently, you've probably seen me do consequence scanning. This is the heart of consequence scanning. Any product, any new idea that you want to implement, before you start building anything, once you have that idea in place, to be able to map the consequences of this idea, right? So you'd be amazed, you're excited, you're ready to build something, and you think it's going to be just the tool you need to create and be helpful. If you get a group of stakeholders together, not just the developers, not just the administrator, not just the Salesforce users, maybe the end users, maybe the folks that are affected by the information that you're putting together, and do consequence scanning. It can be a 45-minute long process, 60 minutes at most, but to be able to think about the consequences that are going to come from this. So they're going to be good intended things, right? But there may be things, good consequences that are unintended that you didn't think about. There may be a lot of bad unintended consequences. That's usually where it really gets flowing, the conversations, right? And this concept is also laid out in the design tools for Salesforce. You can find them. You can go to bit.ly/consequence-scan. That will give you that information. It's free to use. It takes very little time. And one of the outcomes of this is that it really helps you create alignment with your team on what you're trying to accomplish. So you'd be amazed, a little bit of argument, good argument can be helpful in bringing your team together as you look at what you actually want to accomplish. So I highly recommend consequence scanning. There are other tools out there that are available to help you create some alignment initially. And any of these will be much better than none of these if you just use one, whichever one you're more comfortable with. So great, you're prepared for success. You've got this all together, right? You've created the organizational alignment, the common goals. Now, what does maintaining that success look like? You start out great, and then things wander and expand and do things in a different way. So Salesforce also suggests a framework of governance and encourages a COE for nonprofits. So a basic governance framework takes into consideration the vision and strategy, just sounding familiar, the business backlog, the software development lifecycle, data strategy, architecture and management, and communication strategy. And this may sound very technical, but in reality, it's not as technical as you might imagine. So the vision and strategy, we know what that looks like, right? That's where we align everyone on the same path, working toward a common goal. The business backlog really relates more closely to requirements, right? So usually a customer or whoever that customer may be, internal or external, has a long list of wants that require some prioritization to implement over time. And how that happens is governed by the business backlog. So who sets that priority on what gets created first? How does that happen? How do things move up in priority? How do you maintain that iteration? The software development lifecycle, of course, for a smaller organization may seem to be overkill. But as the organization grows and new technology is added, you want to have a system in place to handle releases, updates, migration. When you've already got that in place, then you can scale more quickly and better. Data strategy, architecture, and management. You need a guideline on the data, right? What's personally identifiable information in your organization? What are the data protection regulations? You know, are you working with a customer in the European Union and you have to meet GDPR, or in California and the specific regulations that they have there? What about archiving or deleting or merging data? You know, what is your framework for doing that? How old and out of date does data have to be before you just delete it entirely? One of the things I found with nonprofits is they collect inordinate amounts of data, never do anything with it, and never delete it. So it just sits there. And whether you realize it or not, that's actually a liability for you as well, if it's personal information that you've got. And probably the single most important part for you is the communication strategy, right? So assuring that transparency, that direct communication, so that folks know what is happening, they understand why things happen and what goes on. And those are those building blocks of governance, right? So the next step from that, hang on one second, I'm sorry, I've got too many windows open here. The next step is actually a COE. And what is a COE? Y'all know I hate acronyms. So a COE is actually a center of excellence. And it can be as simple as a committee with a representative from each of those siloed areas in a nonprofit, right? Each program, each piece of the nonprofit that sit down together, right? The more formal definition, which oops, sorry, clicked too fast, is that a COE drives organizations to identify, prioritize, execute, and excuse me, while optimally leveraging people, processes, knowledge, and technology, at the same time ensuring high value for all users and meeting organizational goals. And it might look like this, right? Where you've got maybe the executive director is a sponsor of this group. The program team may be working underneath, and then you've got each piece of the products that come into the group probably won't be this big to start. As a small nonprofit, it may be 3 people that meet once a quarter just to review what's happening and what's going on. But then it can grow with your organization. And again, it's one of those places where there's a group of people that understand what is happening all across the organization. If you've worked with even small organizations, the volunteer team may have different needs and think their priorities are more important. The fundraising team, of course, will think their priorities are more important. And then the actual program implementation team is going to think their priorities are important. So how do you put that all together and keep it going in a way that makes sense? And that's what a center of excellence does. So user adoption and metrics for success. User adoption actually in itself is a great metric for success, right? Especially for a nonprofit cloud implementation project. But how do you accomplish that? Getting users to adopt something you've built is not always as easy as it seems. I'm sure you've had experience with that. And then what do you measure as a benchmark? So let's start with the specific roles that encourage user adoption, right? You have that executive sponsor, someone at the top, at the highest levels, that is, this is going to be fabulous. This is going to help us. This is going to create less workload. You know, that person that gives not only the encouraging words, but also allocates the time and the resources to make this project happen. Champions are something you want to find among the organization that are not risk averse. They're excited about new things that are happening in the company, in the organization. They are going to be more vocal and more able to communicate with their peers about the good things that are coming out of this new functionality. As you go along, there will be early adopters that you need to keep an eye out for and identify. I'm one of those early adopters. I implemented nonprofit success pack before there were instructions, before there was anything, before it was nonprofit success pack, actually. Paige Von Riper and I worked on that. She helped me, she encouraged me, and identified me as an early adopter of that particular product. And then the users themselves. So how do you keep users engaged and get them excited about using the new product instead of dreading having to figure out how they do things differently? Even good change can be difficult. Oops, duplicated. So user surveys are a great way to identify important things that are happening with the users themselves and the adoption that they have. Obviously, you can set those user surveys up on Salesforce. You can set them up, measure them in Salesforce. Be sure that you're taking into consideration whether your users use a mobile device or not. 80% of work is done these days on mobile devices. Maybe not building, maybe not administrating, but the actual users who are logging information, who are looking for information, it's done on mobile devices. So transparency and building that community around the new product. So mix all that well, continuously iterate so that you can, I always feel a little bit like the ophthalmologist when I am talking to users, and do you like number 1 or number 2? 1 or 2? And understand what works best for them and what goes over the easiest. So then you've got metrics for success. Great. It feels successful or it doesn't feel successful, but what about the hard data that actually measures how successful you've been in this project? SMART metrics, if you've not heard of them before, that's an acronym again, right? Everything is. And I'm not going to read this to you because you're probably already familiar with them, but setting those metrics that you can actually measure as data will help you see things in a very different way. So the SMART goals are a good way to start. If you saw before when I showed you the measures for success that we had established as Nonprofit Dreaming, these were our original SMART goals, right? So attendance 500, nonprofit growth, we wanted a 25% survey response rate, a 50 net promoter score, 50% say they would sponsor again, and then 30 average views per session. So a personal story, I am a co-founder, obviously, of Nonprofit Dreaming with Akash Mishra, and I was very disappointed after Nonprofit Dreaming. It did not feel like we had been successful. It didn't feel like that we had accomplished what I wanted to accomplish, what my vision was. And once we sat down and looked at the actual metrics for success, you'll see that we blew the metrics out of the water. So even though I felt like it was not a successful event from my standpoint, in reality, it was a wildly successful event. And so we met and exceeded, and in some cases, hugely exceeded every metric that we had set. So the way it feels at the end of slogging through an important new opportunity is not always in reality whether it was successful or not. So don't be discouraged if it doesn't feel that way. And be sure to write those metrics for success so that when you get to the end, you know where you actually stand. So in summary, let me just say that I do sincerely believe that this chapter, this class, the next class are a couple of the most important things that we can learn to be effective as consultants, effective in creating success for nonprofits. And it really has much more to do with people than it does with technology. The organizational alignment, people don't have to agree to be able to align. So that's important, continuing that with centers of excellence and with governance basics on the technology. And then the user adoption itself, of course, is the outcome of having done a good job of all the things that came before it. Next, we're going to look at what the organization is trying to achieve. And as I said, this is, my point of view, this is probably the second most important part of the entire class, because it has to do with how people align around what they're actually trying to achieve. We'll go a little bit more in depth into not so much figuring out requirements, although that's what comes out of it, but what it is that the organization needs rather than how we're going to build it. So that's an important next upcoming lesson next week. Homework, there are several trailhead badges, some additional resources here. If you need links to anything or have any question about additional tools that maybe we haven't put on the list, let me know, and I will in the Slack channel, and I will be glad to share those with you. And Kathy's going to have office hours when, Kathy? The 12th, Thursday? At 1 p.m.
Sorry, I can't find my unmute button. Yeah, Thursday at 1 o'clock Eastern. And I'm realizing that, next week I'm going to flip that so it's white as well, so you can see it.
No problem. That's great. So if you have any questions, anything you need to bring her to her on Thursday to work through anything, please let me know. And we'll have this up. It'll probably be tomorrow. Have the slide deck and the recording up on the website again. Oh, went the wrong way. Sorry. That's the end. The end.